sacked, and for 10 years he was unemployed, and then 10 years later one of his daughters, who worked in a supermarket, managed to get him a job cleaning the supermarket, sweeping the floor.
I'm Alfie and you're listening to Culture of Coal, a podcast exploring the legacy of energy and industry in 20th century Britain, and the ways in which questions of heritage, energy security and work shape the present. For this episode, I travelled down to Oxford to meet Professor Robert Gildea, Emeritus Professor of Modern History at the University of Oxford. Professor Gildea recently published his book, Backbone of the Nation, Mining Communities in the Great Strike of 1984-85. It explores the dispute and its legacy through extensive oral history interviews with individuals across Scotland, England and Wales. We sat down to discuss his research and the shadow that Britain's last great industrial dispute casts today.
I've basically always been a historian of France, 19th century France, 20th century France. I suppose with a particular interest in the last 20-30 years in the Second World War in France, occupied France, and then the resistance. So I'm not really a historian of Britain, and one of the curious things about the University of Oxford is that the historians are either historians of Britain or what I call everything else historians. So when I was a tutor, I taught European history and world history, but not British history. But the idea for this book about the miners and the mining communities came to me the day Mrs. Thatcher died, which was I think in April 2013, and I was driving back from holiday with my family, listening to the radio, and everyone was coming up to the radio saying what a wonderful person Mrs. Thatcher was, even the people who'd stabbed her in the back. And the only discordant voices were, I think they had a couple of people from the NUM or miners, and they still hated Mrs. Thatcher. And I thought, well, I hated Mrs. Thatcher, so I thought, well, that's something we have in common. And at that time I was writing my book about the French resistance, and I thought, well, what would resistance look like in Britain? Obviously Britain wasn't occupied by the Germans, apart from the Channel Islands, but in a way, the mining communities were occupied by the police from the summer of 1984, so in a way, this was, there was, you could see the miners' strike as a kind of resistance to the power of the state. So I thought that this would be an interesting project. I did speak to one of my colleagues who works on British history. We used to go to the same yoga class, and I said to her after one of the classes, "What do you think if I did this thing on the miners' strike?" She said, "Oh, go for it." So I went for it, and because I had become very interested in oral history, I thought, well, maybe I could use my oral history skills to write the story of the miners' strikes from the point of view of the miners and miners' wives and miners' families, and also some of the activists who were involved, using oral history. Because what I like about oral history is that you have the voice and the stories of the people who are involved, and so it's extremely lively and quite emotional, and you get the nitty gritty.
Well, I was going to ask you what sparked your interest in 1984-85 miners' strike, and I was going to ask you again, why did you write it? But you've covered that. But why? I mean, yourself, you said you were you've lived through the strike at the time, and what were your memories of it at the time from 84, and how has writing the book sort of changed your perspective, or has it changed your perspective on those events?
Well, this is quite an embarrassing question, because at the time, in 1984-85, I was a young lecturer, and at the time I would have been writing a book about 19th century Europe called Barricades and Borders, which was a kind of glorified textbook. And obviously I wasn't teaching British history, and I suppose I took an interest in the strike. or on the news and reading and in the newspapers. But at that point, I wasn't very political. I didn't get involved in any support groups or demonstrations, or I can't even remember giving money to the strike if somebody held a can in front of my face. But I became much more political in my history, really following Brexit. I think Brexit was, I've always been a European. My father was a civil servant who was involved in negotiations to get Britain into what was then called the coal market, or the European Economic Community, in the 1960s. So I think Brexit made me much more political. And in fact, I wrote 2 books which came out of Brexit. One was a book called Empires of the Mind, which was a book about France, but also about Britain. How it was that despite the fact that they'd lost empires, there was still a kind of imperial colonialist mentality in both Britain and France. And the other book was the book about the miners' strike, which I suppose one of the things that I was interested in was the decline of these mining communities after the pit closures, the devastation of those mining communities. Interestingly, what I found in those mining communities were 2 stories. There's what I call the story of ruin, the story of miners having to either being unemployed or taking jobs which are much less well paid, much less skilled, and also the way in which various problems, such as drug problems, swept across some of these former coalfields. But there were also positive stories of former miners, particularly miners' wives, going back to university or going to university and training as social workers or probation officers, and also stories of their children becoming teachers and nurses and doctors. So there are very positive stories that came out of the strike, but very negative stories. And I think when I was interviewing, I did my interviews, started off in 2019 in South Wales, and then they were interrupted by the pandemic. And most of the interviews were in I think I made most of them about 2021. But I always asked, cheekily, at the end of the interview, do you mind telling me how you voted in the referendum? And interestingly, what I discovered was that there was a kind of pattern, but what I think the pattern was that there were some former coalfields where the support groups still existed. So the support groups that supported the strike, raising money, providing food parcels and soup kitchens, those had kind of continued in a way, and they were now often involved in developing heritage and education. And where those networks continue, they tended to vote Remain. But there were other areas, and this was particularly in South Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire, where those networks had collapsed, which incidentally made it very difficult for me to find people to talk to. It's much easier to find networks of people. If the networks already exist, once you found the first person, then you can find all sorts of other people. But if those networks aren't there, it's like finding needles in haystacks. Or you have to find several needles in the haystack. But in those areas where those networks had collapsed, and the stories of deprivation and frustration were much stronger, there you tended to find people voted Leave.
Why do you think? Because that's interesting. The networks had sort of collapsed in South Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire, but lasted longer in places like South Wales and, did you say, Durham as well?
Well, South Wales, County Durham, and also I interviewed up in Fife. So South Wales, there was a group around the sort of Gelais Valley which had continued to function. Quite a lot of the people got involved in politics, local politics, national politics, and there were people like Harold Francis and Sean James who actually got elected to Parliament. And actually they had a kind of revival of confidence in themselves when the film Pride came out, which I think was about 2014. So they were suddenly on the map again, and I think that kind of caused a revival. County Durham, as I say, there was this group around Chester Street, which was the kind of main focus of my interviews. Again, were involved in heritage and education, educating people, campaigning for the restoration of Red Hills, which was the NUM headquarters in Durham. And then up in Fife in Scotland, there'd been a kind of revival because in Scotland there was a campaign to get miners who had been involved in the strike and who had been charged with various offences to do with picketing or intimidation of working miners. They were, if they were arrested, they would certainly be sacked, and many of them didn't get their jobs back. But there was a movement in Scotland 5 or 10 years ago to campaign for a pardon through the Scottish Parliament of those miners. So there was a lot of revival of interest in that campaign for pardon, which again threw up these networks which I was able to access.
And that leads me on really to ask you, what was your research process for the book? I know you speak about it in the opening chapter, but how easy or how hard did you find it to access some of these individuals? Because as you mentioned, you covered coalfields in South Wales, Nottinghamshire, Yorkshire, Leicestershire and Fife. Did you find it was different in different coalfields?
Well, the first stage was a kind of archival stage, and I went to these various areas, Swansea and Sheffield and Nottingham and Durham, and I went to the archives to see whether there were existing interviews. Sometimes there were interviews that had been done at the time or shortly after the strike. I mean, in particular, in Swansea, I mentioned Howell Francis. He was the son of one of the NUM officials in South Wales. He wasn't a miner himself. He went into education. He did continuing education, but he also, for example, did a lot of training of miners who were on day release, so he were basically trained to be becoming union officials. And he also set up something called the South Wales Miners' Library. And in that library there was a collection of tapes that he'd done, or cassette tapes that he'd done, following the strike, and I listened to all those. And that immediately gave you, a link to these people. Obviously those tapes, I don't know if you remember those old cassette tapes, I think it's 40 minutes on each side, and then it goes click and that's the end. And so they weren't what we call life history interviews. So I'm used to something called the life history interview, where you start off by talking about someone's childhood and where they were brought up and their family, school, work, and then you come on to the central thing, which in this case was the strike, and then talk about their involvement in the strike, and then the third part of the interviews what happened after the strike, in terms of their work, in terms of their family, in terms of their community. So basically, yes, the first thing was to see what interviews still existed. But for example, the very rich in South Wales, Sheffield, there were some interviews. There were interviews with a couple of women who'd run a support group in Asken near Doncaster. So again, I went to visit them. And I interviewed them, and they talked about a guy called Richardson. I can't remember his first name. And they said, "Oh, well, he'll never talk to you. He'll never talk to you because he lost his job after the strike. He's kind of a recluse." But they gave me his phone number, and later on, I think it was when the pandemic was easing off, I just decided I'd give him a call. Could I do this interview with you? And he said yes. So I got in the car the next day before he could change his mind and turn up on his doorstep and did an interview. And then later on, when I kind of was more permanently in that area, I spent a couple of weeks up there. I kind of managed to get an interview with his wife and with his son. I suppose the word it's in oral history they call it snowballing. So you start with a small snowball, and then as you roll it down the hill, it becomes bigger and bigger. But as I say, it's through networks that these things happen.
And what stood out for you travelling around former coalfield communities, and you've met so many people, so many from different areas? Is there anything that sort of stood out for you amongst some of these people that were involved in the strike, or anything that you've witnessed or heard that really sort of stuck with you?
Quite a lot of suffering on the one hand, but this enormous generosity. And I think one of the things that interested me was the intergenerational thing. So whereas most of the people I interviewed were, as I say, former miners and their wives, but I also interviewed a certain number of children and a few grandchildren, and I just give you an example. So when I went up to Fife, I interviewed this guy. He was called Ronnie Campbell, and his nickname was Red Ronnie or Ronnie Scargill, because he chaired the strike committee in a place called Lochor, and after he'd been arrested during the strike, sacked, and for 10 years he was unemployed, and then 10 years later one of his daughters, who worked in the supermarket, managed to get him a job cleaning the supermarket, sweeping the floor. And he was an amazing guy. When I met him, he was one of these people who had lung condition. He has his inhaler, and he basically had these two strong daughters on each side, more or less propping him up. So I interviewed him with his two daughters, and one of the daughters talked about how during the strike she was still at school, but she had been digging up potatoes for a bit of money, and during the strike also one day their school children came out on strike and picketed a kind of coal dump where lorries were taking coal from this dump to power stations, and it was involved in this mass picket. And then a few days later, I interviewed Ronnie again with two of his grandchildren. And again, the granddaughter, who was in her 20s, had been to one of these hearings to do with pardoning miners. And, she'd stood up in this, very bravely stood up in this meeting and said, one of the things we have to look at is that, a lot of the people I know from school and in the community have drug issues. And she said those drug issues map exactly onto the former mining areas. So what struck me was that there's a kind of intergenerational memory and experience of the strike, which still continues.
That leads me on really to a question about the legacy of the strike. You wrote the book at a time when we saw a resurgence of trade union activity in Britain. I know it ends in sort of 22, 23 in the foreword, and you discussed that. But the mood now in Britain is, in particular in ex-mining communities, is very dark. It's very different to even how it was 2 years ago. And do you think we're still seeing the impact of the strike? I mean, you've sort of answered that then, but do you think it offers any lessons for the nation's future or for the future of these communities?
Well, in a sense, what I've described the miners' strike as the last great industrial battle of the 20th century, and you may see there haven't been that many industrial battles in the 21st century. So it was a sort of class war, and it was the mobilisation of a trade union and of mining communities behind the trade union in defence of their jobs and their communities. And so it was, in a sense, the last gasp of working class activism. And what happened after that, Thatcher, in a sense, provoked the strike in order to smash the unions, starting with the NUM. And there's a famous document called the Ridley Report, which in fact the Tories, Nicholas Ridley, was a minister of Thatcher, but this was actually drafted when they were in opposition in 1977, and it basically said, well, if there's another miners' strike, we're going to be ready for them. We're going to stockpile coal. We're going to deprive miners' families of benefits, and we're going to militarise the police. Because the Tories had been ousted as a result of the strikes of 72 and 74. They wanted vengeance against the miners, so they also tightened up the rules about secondary picketing and the need for a secret ballot before strikes happened, and so there was an offensive against the miners, which kind of had its culmination at the Battle of Orgreave. But that destruction of the NUM, prefaced the destruction of other trade unions, and it sort of coincided with the globalisation of the economy. And so we don't really have, we still have trade unions, but they're much weaker than they used to be. The labour movement doesn't really exist. And this means that, politics has changed from being politics about class to politics about identities and different communities and about Britishness versus immigration. So I think it's a completely different form of politics, and you may find that in former mining areas, people who had been involved in the strike are now involved. Their main preoccupation is how immigrants have affected their lives. But the sad thing is, it's not immigrants who who've undermined their prosperity. It's the globalised economy and the smashing of unions. And so I suppose I did think, well, a book like this about the miners' strike could refresh people's minds about what the strike was about. And in theory, we know there is supposed to be an inquiry into the Orgreave, happened at Orgreave. It was in the Labour Party manifesto. I think things are afoot to have an inquiry into Orgreave, and if that happens, then there may again be a return to thinking about what the strike was all about, and in terms of class politics.
And do you have any plans to continue the legacy of the book and maintain ties with the communities you work with? I believe, did you go to Hatfield recently, and you've done some work there, haven't you, and with some of the activists in sort of South Yorkshire?
Obviously last year was the 40th anniversary of the strike, and I was particularly busy in March. I went to events in South Yorkshire, I went up to County Durham, I went up to Fife, I went to South Wales, I went to a number of these commemorations to see what was happening. I even briefly met Arthur Scargill. And I suppose, and also I have been to a couple of funerals of miners who I had interviewed. So I mean, I would say that I now count. I now have friends in these former mining communities, and those friendships will stay with me. So I think it's more. I don't think I'm going to do any more research in the area, but. The friendships that I've made certainly stay with me.
What was the response to the book from the people you work with? I imagine it was really well received.
Well, am I allowed to read something from the back of the book?
Yeah, go for it.
So this was, I mentioned Sian James, who was involved in the support group in the Julice Valley, and subsequently became an MP, and subsequently her character is played in the film Pride, and this is the quote that she gave me from the back of the book, and it says, "At last, a book about the strike that gives an honest overview of what happens to miners, their families and communities. We entrusted Gildea with our memories, and he has in return told our story with dignity and a historian's eye." And that line meant a great deal to me, because they did entrust me with their stories. I mean, in order to get a good interview, the person has to trust you personally, and in terms of what you're going to do with what they tell you. And so I would like to think that I gave them a good account, and as I say, the book is kind of woven from their interviews. And I suppose I like to think that I've not given them back dignity, because they are proud people, but underpinned their dignity. And in fact, the title "Backbone of the Nation" came from an interview I did with an old miner who died not that long after I interviewed him. And he said that his father had told him, his father was also a miner, told him, and this would have been, his father would have been a miner around the time of the First World War. He said, my father told me that the miners were the backbone of the nation, because without the miners, quote, the country could not go. When you think that, at that point, Britain was a single fuel economy. Everything ran off coal, the railways, the factories, electricity, heating. So they were the backbone of the nation. Obviously, Mrs. Thatcher called them the enemy within. So in a sense, it's a kind of, she called them the enemy within, I call them the backbone of the nation.